So welcome. I'm Dina Grant, Associate Professor of Jewish Studies at Hartford Seminary. It's wonderful to have you join us here today and to welcome you to this webinar panel on community prayer in a pandemic, how faith leaders are adapting. For this panel, we have brought together congregational leaders from the three Abrahamic faiths to discuss their experiences and offer their wisdom. But before I introduce them, I'd like to talk a bit about why we are here today. These days, we are in uncharted waters, physically, psychologically, spiritually. Almost none of us alive today has ever been through anything quite like this. And we don't yet know the long-term impacts of this pandemic on us physically, psychologically, and spiritually. But it is impacting us now, and many of us do sense that it will impact us for some time to come. During crises, people of faith turn to their places of worship and to their communities of faith for emotional and even physical support. It is to our synagogues, churches, and mosques that even the most skeptical of skeptics may turn amid crisis, sickness, pain, and suffering. We turn there for support from God. We turn there for support from our communities. And yet the pandemic, the social distancing in particular, has demanded that our sanctuaries close their doors for our safety. This demand challenges, if not our faith, then at the very least our institutions of faith. Our places of worship are empty. As the book of Lamentations describes Jerusalem and the temple in Jerusalem, our sanctuaries are lonely, bitterly weeping. And to think that they are empty because they are unsafe is quite difficult. So a question is, what does the future hold for our places of worship? What is the future of our faith communities? What is the future of our clergy? I'd like to quote an excerpt from the words of Reverend Francis Grimke, an African-American pastor of the 15th Street Presbyterian Church in DC, as he reflected on and wrestled with this. If, as a matter of fact, it is dangerous to meet in theaters and in schools, it certainly is no less dangerous to meet in churches. The fact that the churches are places of religious gathering and the others not does not affect in the least the health question involved. If avoiding crowds lessens the danger of being infected, it is wise to take the precaution and not needlessly run in danger and expect God to protect us. And so, anxious as I have been to resume work, I have waited patiently until the order is lifted. I start to worry at first, as it seems to upset all of our plans for the fall. But I soon recover my composure. I said to myself, why worry? God knows what he is doing. His work isn't going to suffer. It will rather be a help to it in the end. Out of it, I believe great good is coming. All the churches, as well as the community at large, are going to be stronger and better for this season of distress through which we have been passing. The Reverend offered these words on Sunday, November 3rd, 1918, reflecting on the lockdown of the churches due to the influenza pandemic. He was a congregational leader who struggled with the closing of his church during a pandemic, who questioned it, but who ultimately had faith that the religious institution would adapt. Do we possess this same confidence today? Well, whatever precisely the future holds, if synagogues, churches, and mosques are going to be stronger, then it will be in large part because of the wise leadership, ingenuity, and resolve of our congregational leaders. what they are doing today is shepherding us through till tomorrow. And this is why we brought Jewish, Christian, and Muslim panelists together today to share with us some of their wisdom and the wisdom that springs from their different faith traditions. A silver lining of the pandemic is that it has reminded us that our religious communities are all part of a larger human community. A human community that we must support through physical sickness and fight for against social sickness, against the poverty and injustice that such a pandemic brings into harsh light. And so that is why we've come together today to hear from our co-religionists, our congregational leaders, about the challenges and opportunities they are confronting during these difficult and unusual times. And so I am happy to introduce you to Bishop Dr. Benjamin Watts. Bishop Watts is the senior pastor of the Shiloh Baptist Church of New London, Connecticut, where he has served for over 30 years. Dr. Watts is also Hartford Seminary's professor in religion and community life and the director of the Black Ministries program, and someone who many of us at the seminary regularly turn to for his wisdom. I would also like to welcome Imam Rafai Arifin. Imam Rafai serves as the assistant imam of the Islamic Association of Greater Hartford, the Berlin Mosque. He has spoken at countless mosques, churches, schools, and universities throughout the state of Connecticut on Islam, its spiritual underpinnings, and social manifestations. Welcome, Imam Rafai. And finally, I would like to welcome Rabbi Tuvia Brander, who is the rabbi of my synagogue at the Young Israel of West Hartford. Rabbi Brander just pulled off a beautifully socially distant Rosh Hashanah service and is about to do it again, I hope, for Yom Kippur. And so to delve right into the topic at hand, I would ask, how are you reconciling the importance of communal prayer with the importance of social distancing? And I would ask Dr. Watts if you might start us off.
Thank you, Dr. Grant. It's an important topic in this season that we're going through. I made the proclamation to my congregation not long ago using the same 1918 pandemic that was called the Spanish flu, to remind everyone that we are all living witnesses that our religious institutions can survive a pandemic. And the reason we know we're witnesses is because we're here. They went through it, and we are here as testimonies that in the post-time, we not only can survive, but thrive. So we are the witnesses of that. It's a very difficult time because most of us are used to in-person gathering. Social distancing keeps us from the touch and feel and harmony and rhythm that is our normal worship and prayer experience. What we have learned to do was to take the in-person experience and to create a form of it in the online expressions that we do on several platforms. So between the Facebook, YouTube, and Vimeo type platforms, we're able to continue to connect. We've also found that people connect well with the live streams of those services in dialogue back and forth with each other. It's not the same. We are fortunate enough that we had already purchased cameras and equipment, and we were already doing video of services so that we didn't have to go and purchase anything new immediately to start. But it has been a transition that is starting to work. We're starting to find our legs. We are in a bit of a moment of shock for our congregation right now. Our principal musician and our chief psalmist, so to speak, is suddenly at age 50 just dropped dead yesterday. And so we are in the middle of kind of a nightmare as a congregation. They're so used to seeing him, it feels like a gut punch to the congregation. So no one knows if it's COVID related or what. He breathed deeply a few times and was unable to get his breath. And by the time the paramedics came, it was over. So 2020 has been some kind of year, and we will find another way to continue worshiping while we support this family. What's really difficult is that also means we have to find a new way to honor his passing, because all of our traditions are not available to us, as our other colleagues will definitely speak to. But we will do it, and we must. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Watts. Yeah, and your point that we're here as testimony really resonates. Thank you. Imam Rafai.
First off, good evening to everyone. Thanks especially to Professor Grant for putting this together. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be part of this. And definitely I want to express that I'm sorry for your loss, Dr. Watts. It's something, kind of a side note before I answer the question. While we're tackling all of those issues of prayer and social distancing, we're also trying to be there as a source of comfort and to be a resource for the community. And so it's a delicate balancing where we're trying to focus there and also be emotionally present. With respect to your question, I think the balance has always been there. You know, it's an issue that goes to the heart of communal prayer. How is it that we can be with God and with each other at the same time? And so sometimes in normal circumstances, we focus on the communal or the social aspect of prayer and rituals in religion. And sometimes the individual, or if you'll allow me, the spiritual aspect gets lost. And so what we've witnessed with COVID is a kind of decoupling of those two things, because we're kind of forced to be alone. And I think that has forced our community to realize that devotional prayer in particular is about being with God regardless of the circumstances, whether one is alone or in the presence of co-religionists. So yes, there was a loss in that we weren't able to physically be present with each other, but I feel that our community and many other communities throughout the world found ways to be together in presence or in spirit, whether it meant worshiping together, whether it meant checking up on each other, or perhaps reconnecting as a family. You talked about challenges and opportunities. I hope in the course of our discussion, we'll have a chance to talk about how by moving worship away from specific spaces, such as a church, a synagogue, or a mosque, it actually made the homes the place in which God is remembered and prayer actually takes place. So definitely, it was a great challenge in terms of how to shift to the virtual world, but also we found a lot of benefits from having that take place.
Thank you. A mikdash ma'at, a small holy sanctuary of our home. Rabbi Brander.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Grant, and the Hartford Seminary for hosting us. It's good to see so many of you. And Dr. Watts, also my deepest condolences. And your community mourns. And I think that's something also that as we get further in the conversation, one of the things that religious communities are mourning is our lack of opportunity to mourn, and to mourn in the same way, and the loss of that moment of grief and the suspension of those experiences itself is a loss. Your question about how do we balance prayer and social distancing, and so I think I started, and it sounds to be the same as my fellow panelists in that, I think in the Jewish religion, there's a prioritization of health. And so that right off the boat, right off from the start it takes priority. And that was, the very tough decision we were amidst of celebrating our 50th year and 50 years of worship services day in and day out, to then have to make the unfathomable decision to close our synagogue. But that was the right thing to do. It was the right thing then, and we were sure of it when we did it, and we were sure of it, all the more today as we continue to, watch and try to be proactive in ensuring that our community and the broader community stays safe. And it brings up a number of challenges and decouples different things that are, again, connected. I just want to raise one of them. In planning for the resumption of our services in the Jewish faith and the Orthodox denomination, which I'm privileged to be a part of. So as much as we try to go onto Zoom and onto virtual settings, in order to have formal communal prayer, you need to have a quorum of individuals in proximity to each other. And so we were unable to take advantage of fully prayers on Zoom, on Facebook Live, and all the other different opportunities. We did have, prayers in parallel, but it lacked a certain cornerstone of what our prayers really were. And then as we began to come back, in addition to all the procedures that we put into place, masks, and we're still outside and making sure that there is a physical distance between people, one of the things that came up was really cut to the core of what prayer is about. At least in the Jewish faith, prayer consists of two polar opposites that we kind of conflate, and at sometimes are in tension, but right now we see that a very strong tension. And that is, there's a ritual, obligatory side of prayer, and there is the ecstatic, spontaneous, devotional, spiritual side of prayer. In the Talmud, we actually see two different sources for prayer. And it's a debate in the Talmud. In the end, we say really it draws from both, but they represent these two poles. Is prayer draws its inspiration and pattern instituted to follow the day in, day out routine sacrifice in the temple. And that is the cold ritual, regardless of what you're feeling at the moment. There's the obligation to bring that sacrifice or have that prayer in the morning, in the afternoon, and at night. Or is prayer patterned after the experiences of our forefathers in the Bible, which are moments of ecstatic prayer to God, either in times of suffering, as Jacob flees his father's home and goes off into an exile, or as Isaac is in the field communing with nature and with the divine. Those are also sources of prayer, but a very different type of prayer. And normally when we have communal prayer, we try to pull off both, right? We have the obligatory side, we say the ritual and the liturgy that's supposed to be said, but we do it with songs, we do it with music, we do it in the context of community, we do it with an understanding of the words at a pace that really we can take it all in. And that works 99% of the time, except when you have a situation where we're trying to get back to have that communal prayer in its full pristine form, but singing becomes problematic. The amount of time that we can be together is problematic. What we can say, the quantity that we can say becomes challenged. And so then all of a sudden we start asking ourselves, on the one hand, we want to fulfill the ritual obligatory side of prayer, but we don't want to totally compromise the spiritual ecstatic side of prayer. And how do we bridge both? And that, going into the holidays and really going into every prayer experience we have 3 times a day, every day, is a challenge that I face in the clergy, but I am blessed to have partners in my synagogue thinking about this balance as we try to figure it out.
Thank you. I'll take my opportunity as moderator, actually ask a question on this, which is, well, how have you been able to reconcile or deal with ecstatic versus ritual? For all of you, in fact, I'd ask the question, how has either the content of the prayer in community changed, or the nuance and tenor of it changed in light of the current moment? Have you needed to compromise one for the other in light of our current situation? Would somebody want to take that question? first.
We have been challenged by the pandemic in that generally in a large congregation, choral music is a big part of singing and the worship experience. And so now you can't gather the choir to sing. So in order to deal with that challenge, we have been rather creative, trying to create opportunities and doing sort of these new ways of bidding people to sing together individually and then blending them together for some of these Zoom videos you've probably seen of choirs and members in different boxes trying to do it. Some of what we have experienced by this time is going to have an effect going forward, because people are trying to figure out, what is my part in worship? How can I be a participant in worship and not be physically present? Or is it the same for us when we're not the gathered body or the beloved community? And it's difficult, but we're finding ways to do it, and some of which are causing us to have to re-examine theology. Yeah. And that's something that I hear both Rabbi and Imam touching on, because we're trying to figure out, how do we do the ritual and still make sure we are within the bounds of the parameters of our given faith tradition. And for some of it, we've been able to do, other parts not so much. And it's a really difficult time as we now rereading scripture afresh to see, can I fit this in? Will this make sense? And does it have a carryover? And I think we're discovering every week, and that's changing the way we do worship now.
Yeah, thank you. I'll add to my question what Dr. Watts answered at this moment, which is, what do you think, what impact do you think this period may have that will reverberate longer term with regard to the religious institution, the role of the clergy, good, bad, ugly? What will change and extend beyond the present? I'm asking you to be prophets.
Well, I'm not sure that I can really predict the future, but I can speak to what's already happened.
Yeah.
And definitely to continue what Professor Watts, Dr. Watts was mentioning, we've had that challenge of conducting our ritual prayers. In Islam, we pray basically with our hands. So there are movements that are involved, and there's recitation that's involved as well. And as Muslims, we pray 5 times a day. So right off the bat, as soon as we closed the mosque, we immediately had to address the question of, well, what about the daily prayers? What about the weekly service? What can we continue? What are we going to have to suspend? And we very quickly realized that actually we needed to suspend all of the services. And that created a challenge, because in order to have the communal prayers, you need to have a group of people who are, as the rabbi mentioned, who are physically present in proximity with respect to each other. So yes, you can have some social distancing, but if they're not physically in the same space, that makes it almost impossible. And what we figured out, especially during the month of Ramadan, was that we could conduct through social media, through Zoom, Facebook, and Instagram. We could conduct those services, and people could watch, and then they could also have the prayers on their own as an individual. And what we witnessed happen was that people who normally weren't engaged, who weren't attending regularly, were interested in participating. So we have a lot of young people who are on our social media channels, on Facebook, on Instagram, which are things that we cultivated prior to COVID, but we never really capitalized on. And then when COVID happened, we were well situated in order to reach that demographic of younger people. And what we noticed is that their vision of of religious practice was more interactive, right? So they wanted to have sessions where they could ask the difficult questions. They wanted to engage on social issues, right? Especially particularly social justice issues of tackling racism and social ills that exist within the society. And they expected religious leaders to talk about it and not to gloss over it. And so we noticed that some of our content started to change and become more responsive to the needs of the community simply by virtue of the fact that we had more interactive sessions and they were reaching a younger demographic. And so that's something that really excites me, is the fact that yes, prior to COVID, we were reaching a lot of families, but we were losing a lot of young adults who felt that some of what we were preaching wasn't relevant to their day-to-day lives. And so this challenge has forced us to basically be a little bit more introspective as individuals and also as a community, to make sure that our message not only speaks to the higher level spiritual issues, the character issues that we're always going to talk about, but also to talk about how that translates to realities on a societal level, on a family level. And so I think that's a good outcome, that occurred as a result of moving from a physical space onto the virtual space.
Yeah, thank you. I guess it goes hand in hand with what you were talking about with regard to the decoupling of the individual and the community and how that changes things. Thank you. Rabbi Brander?
So, I think I'm going to answer a couple of the questions that we've kind of posed now. In terms of the balance between the ritual and the ecstatic, the spiritual and the rote, I think we've balanced it in a way that's unique to liturgy, in that we're able to kind of do multiple things at the same time. We just came off the holiday of Rosh Hashanah, and there's debate in Jewish thought whether Rosh Hashanah is actually a very happy day or a more somber day. And there are manifestations of that. Is one allowed to fast on Rosh Hashanah or not? You have to decide one or the other. Either you're allowed to fast or you're not. You can't kind of be in the middle. The beautiful thing about liturgy and prayer is that there are parts of our liturgy that are really happy and upbeat and celebratory. And there are parts that are really somber. And you're able to hold both these emotions in a way that other aspects of faith tradition just aren't able, because you have to make those decisions. And so we've kind of been able to do that. I think it's also been an interesting message about the role of prayer in our lives, particularly in the Jewish faith, although I imagine it's similar in others, and that people sometimes come to prayer and they feel uninspired, and they sit there and they feel in the pews like this just didn't do this for me today. And number one is that's normal and that's okay, and we continue to pray even if it's not going to be rainbows every day. The other part is that we all have to be more active participants and agents in making our prayer meaningful. And that's kind of a position that COVID has pushed people into. And we'll talk about the home. I think it's been alluded to a couple of times, but there's so many people who have found prayer practices with their family. And even with our abbreviated services now, begin with their family doing certain parts that we have chosen, unfortunately, to leave out because of the time constraints that we have in keeping with some of the medical guidance that we've given. And that has become a beautiful tradition to, within their families, and that will probably continue. In terms of, how have things changed from a theological perspective, I very much believe that things haven't changed from a theological perspective. The way we voice those things, the music that we bring to that message might change, but the actual message, the core message, remains the same. And I recall as we made the decision to close our synagogue back in March, that the last time I spoke from the pulpit and taught some words of Torah and communal Torah study was reflecting on the 1831 cholera pandemic, and how rabbis there responded to that moment by alternating seats in the synagogue and closing those seats. At that time, social distancing wasn't really a term we were thinking about, and we definitely weren't thinking about the high holidays. We thought we would be back, in a couple of months. but there's a timelessness to all the faith traditions, but I can speak particularly to Judaism, in that many of these questions that we're asking ourselves, we're not even having to go to primary sources to find the response. We can look through our history and see how Jews have responded in those moments, how Jews have responded to similar situations and different situations in that moment. In terms of your last point of what will continue, the good, the bad, and the ugly, I think a couple of things. Obviously, I'm not a prophet, but I think the role that communities play and organized religion plays in people's lives will continue to find value. There was a study, I think Robert Putnam and others have pointed out, that Americans are becoming more spiritual but less affiliated. I think being on someone's list from a social aspect, being part of a congregation. I know in our synagogue, and I just want to point out we have Dr. Les Lowe here. Dr. Les Lowe was the president of the synagogue during this time. It was an invaluable partner in making the incredibly difficult decision to close our synagogue and all the different things we had to go through. One of the things that he led was the board of our synagogue called every member of our synagogue, checking in on regular intervals. Gyms didn't do that. If I was a American, whatever the gym is down the block, as you can tell, I'm not so familiar with it, unfortunately. But the gyms didn't call their membership rolls and see how they were doing if they needed food, but synagogues and churches and mosques were. And people realized the value of membership. What does it mean to be part of a community? There was a study that was done in the midst of the pandemic in the Jewish community by the Neshama Research Institute. I happened to be able to see a version of it before the survey went out, and I asked them to tack on a question. For people who are part of synagogues, do they value their membership more, equally, or less during the pandemic? And particularly for the younger generation, who we were seeing trends that were not affiliating because, for whatever reason, how do they view membership? And across the board, we have seen that people realize that being members actually makes a difference. And I think that is, I see that with my own peer group, that many of them have now made the decision to join synagogues and to be engaged. I think that's a powerful moment of the pandemic, and also a response to the credit of the faith communities. I just wanted to talk about virtual prayer for a second and online. I think one of the interesting things, and I appreciate the Imam's example because I think it's the right example as opposed to some of the other things that I've been seeing. There are two types of prayers where I'm seeing, and I've been able to go, conservative, reform, Orthodox prayers. It's great. I've been able to sit in my living room and choose the flavor of the day. There are different types. There are types where you have, it's almost like the top of my screen, where half of you have your camera on and you're nodding and I can see you and we're actually interacting. And I'm not saying anything about the other half who have their camera off. But there are different types of ways that people come in. If you're logging in and it's a performance, you're watching a movie or you're watching a performance going on. So I wonder how much that's really going to take an effective role of engaged prayer. That's, a TV Zoom channel. On the other hand, when we talk about what examples like the Imam was sharing, where you have people coming in and they're engaging, and then they're having discussion, and they're really being able to build community virtually. I think those type of manifestations of virtual distance prayer will actually be able to be sustained and will create greater connection.
Thank you. You're echoing, it sounds like, also what Imam Rafai was saying with regard to reaching people where they are in the younger generation. And so
but providing content that is interactive and engaging, as opposed to providing content. One of the things, when we think about programs for the synagogue, we ask ourselves, are we doing a Zoom TV channel? Or are we providing an engaged program? Because I can tell you, we have great speakers and talent in our community, but you look across the world and you will find someone better. And what's on, NPR or, CBS or whatever TV channel you have at home is going to be better than what I can create on my computer and play through the delayed shared screen that Zoom provides, right? This is the reality. But the community, the community of worship that we can together engage each other and build that spiritual connection, that you can't get on Hulu or Netflix or wherever you're watching TV.
Thank you. Before we continue, I just want to, for those who are listening, I'd like to give an opportunity in a few moments to ask questions to the entire panel, to someone in particular in the panel. So if you might start thinking about a question you may have, you could write it in the chat, or you could think of it in your head, and when the time comes, do one of those hand raises or an actual hand raise, so that we can also address some of the things that you've been thinking about. I'd ask another question, which gets a little bit off prayer, but what are some of the more pressing issues that your community members are dealing with now that you're being called into, where people are seeking your pastoral services, with regard to spiritual issues, with regard to health issues? Are you seeing an uptick in certain things? Are you seeing, I've been reading a lot about the loneliness that people are feeling. Is that coming into your offices, into virtually? Are you experiencing something different pastorally than you had been in the past?
If I may, just two things. I want to first hit on a lingering thing that's going to happen afterwards. And the first is virtual communities are going to, I think, expand in terms of no matter what religious tradition, people are learning to communicate online in different ways, and not only communicate, but talk about what their experiences were in that setting. To even say this service met my needs or it didn't meet my needs to other people in sort of the virtual world. And that I find interesting. Anecdotally, I've actually seen our small team that we have coming in the sanctuary to put on the service that is going across line. Even they will get online and participate in the virtual conversation, the virtual amens or affirmations or additions during the service that would have not done that prior to. And I see that as something happening even once the sanctuary is fully open. People will still want to respond in community. And that's maybe a Christian thing, but it's an interesting thing, maybe a church thing. The second thing is that because of the pandemic, we had our doors closed for large gathered worship, but we were still meeting needs and still are meeting needs in terms of feeding. So we were doing meals and doing food giveaways. And so people would drive on the lot, food be placed in the trunk, so contactless free, contact-free gifting of food and needs being met. That is still something that's going to have to continue, because even after the larger part of the pandemic is brought under control, the effects of it, particularly in communities who were working on the margins economically, and particularly those in the gig economy, their resources are now so reduced. When people are not going to work, you don't see the need for ride sharing, things like Lyft and all those others. So that gig economy is really reduced in terms of people's ability to raise money or raise resources. So that need is going to be there and has been there. One of the things, someone made a remark as cars were coming through, and it sounds like a slight until you hear the retort. There were cars coming through that were very nice cars. And it was like, what are you doing in this line with this beautiful car? And this, you look like you're doing well. Until someone responded and said, 2 months ago, I was doing well. This car made sense before I got laid off. A $200 payment was fine on my salary before. Now I'm laid off. I have a car, but I have no food. I can't feed my family. And so those needs are there. And I think the third need that we're really seeing now is the social need. There are people who are outgoing by nature. They are used to being in community. And church and synagogue and mosque, they are communities of fellowship as much as they are of worship. A lot goes around them that is very social. And the removal of that social, particularly in some of our really older adults who are not used to using FaceTime and getting online and whatever, that loss of that social has really been difficult for them. So we've got a whole nother set of needs that are wrapped around that and calls related to that. I'll stop and give my colleagues a chance to speak on and welcome their perspective.
Imam, I see you.
Sure. Well, to your question, I've noticed three issues that have come up and two positive trends, counterweighing the three issues. Definitely the biggest one would be mental health. I think that this is a challenge throughout all layers of society, and there's a lot of stigma associating with asking for help or admitting feelings of depression or anxiety. But I feel like on one hand, we saw people who weren't experiencing that in the past, feeling that due to COVID-19. But then we also saw a lot of people felt who were feeling that way, also feel that there was less stigma associated with asking for help because of COVID-19. I hope everybody's following what I'm saying. So yes, we saw more people who wanted help, but then the fact that they were willing to ask for help or willing to talk to someone, whether it's in the pastoral context, whether it's them reaching out to me and saying, hey, can we have a chat? Whereas prior to COVID, they probably wouldn't have, reached out. Or perhaps be more willing if I give them a referral and say, hey, this is a great person to talk to. Let's see if, why don't you give them a call? And a lot of people who previously, if I had given them that referral, they would not have actually followed up on it. So I think that there's less stigma in the society, particularly because of COVID, that there's nothing wrong in feeling that way, that you're socially isolated, you're stuck at home, perhaps you're furloughed, you're unemployed, or as Professor Dr. Watts mentioned, you might be part of the gig economy and you might have economic insecurity where it's like, okay, I was doing well a few months ago. I might be okay next month, but I really don't know. So maybe I need to kind of tighten things up a little bit because of the insecurity. And so we definitely witnessed that in our community, and the effect that the stress has of the uncertainty and not knowing what's going to happen the next month definitely took a toll. So the mental health would be the biggest one. We also noticed the mental health spilling over into family issues, right? So we saw a lot of people, sometimes it's like Shakespeare said, proximity breeds contempt, right? So I don't know whether that's true, or whether distance, makes the heart grow fonder. I'm not an expert in that. But what I do know is that a lot of people being stuck at home and feeling that they didn't have control, that they could go somewhere or they didn't have an outlet to kind of escape that situation, I think it had a lot of negative consequences. I don't know about other communities. We saw an uptick for a certain period in domestic violence, which was extremely concerning. And I think that happened at all levels of society. And then the third issue is families that were grieving a sick loved one or a loved one that passed away. And many of those deaths that occurred in the community were not related to COVID. I mean, some were, but the vast majority weren't. But because we didn't have the typical gatherings that come along with death, I feel like a lot of families felt that they were robbed of closure. In many cases, you had families scattered in different places around the world or different states. They weren't able to attend funerals. They weren't able to be with each other physically. And that also created a more difficult process in terms of the grief process. And so those are the three issues that we witnessed. But I also saw two other things that were really uplifting. One of them, Dr. Watts already touched upon, which is that act of charity and service that just happened organically. And that was so wonderful to witness. We had a group in our community that put together, that actually organized to create masks for nursing homes, for hospitals, for medical providers. They came together and generated thousands of masks at a time in which we really had a great shortage and they were so direly needed. We saw community members that banded together to make sure that everybody had enough food. We also saw that the families that were affected directly with illness and with the coronavirus didn't have to leave their home. We made sure that food and basic supplies were delivered to them. And it was just wonderful. Yes, we did organize at some level, but also we had a lot of people volunteering and wanting to be engaged, and people who we hadn't seen really engaged at that level before. And the last thing, I know I've taken a little bit of time, the last thing that I would want to speak to is the social media aspect. I know I keep going back to that because I feel like there are a lot of young people who are disengaged with religion in general. And that's actually the generation that needs religion more than anyone else. What I've noticed is that prior to COVID, people were connected to billions of other people, and yet they felt completely atomized or socially isolated. And I think social media has that ironic effect where like you're posting, you're waiting for likes, you want people to interact, you want people to comment, but in reality, at the end of the day, you actually feel like those connections are superficial and that they're not meaningful and that they don't typically bring happiness to the participant. What I've noticed, because in many cases it's very toxic, that that need for trying to present yourself in a very polished way in order to impress others, that actually takes a toll, I think, on the individual. During COVID, I noticed that it became less toxic and became more endearing. It became more encouraging, where there was a lot of positivity that was shared in social media, and particularly among young people within our community, where people would call each other, they would comment, they would try to uplift each other and send positive messages, positive vibes that, we are going to get through this and everybody's going to be fine at the end of the day. So even though we had those challenges, I do think that our community it rose to the challenge and that they're going to continue to do so.
Thank you. Before we continue, does anyone have a question to our panelists or a particular one among our panelists? I see a hand. Dr. Grafton?
Can I ask?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Thank you for the panelists for wonderful comments and reflections on how to lead their communities through this. Just great, and I learned a lot. So for liturgical and sacramental Christian communities who celebrate the Eucharist or communion regularly, this really prompted a crisis in the communities about withholding the elements, but it also prompted an opportunity for theological conversation about where can they celebrate, who can celebrate, how. So it's really generated a lot of conversation about that. And I really appreciated Rabbi Brander's comments earlier about finding a balance between the tradition and the worship practices and the health realities, having to shorten the prayers because of time and all that. I really appreciated that. But I'm curious if any of you find this generational shift, or will find a generational shift between younger people who are getting into these conversations now and maybe asking, well, what's the big deal about it anyway? Why don't we, they don't have the longevity of time in the community or the traditions. And so I wonder if any of you have thoughts about how this may be at the other end, between how younger people come out of this and think, well, let's do this differently.
If I can, Dean, Dr. Grant, what's interesting for my community is that was the very first difficult conversation when April came around, because it was time to celebrate to use the elements. And within our tradition, as in many Christian traditions, an accommodation had been made for the celebration of the communion within the home of the sick. So you could bring the communion there, and someone would be there to bless the communion and share it, whatever. So now the question is, could that same accommodation now be extended to all of the homes who were not sick now, but who were now in virtual? And does it have the same effect if it is blessed from one place? And does it have to be specific wine or specific crap? And so it really was a real interesting conversation, which I can say ended up in the accommodation for all. But it was not without its rigorous debate about it. And some congregations are still in debate about it, and they will not take or celebrate the elements with the elements again until they're together as a body. It's an interesting question. And those are some of the things that I think are going to linger on, because people will now, I think, tune in to the doctor that's at his office, the person who can't leave from their workplace will now tune in for the worship experience to receive the elements from where they are in a new world. And that will be, I think, one of the extensions that will come out of this, at least in our group. Can't speak to other groups. Some groups have allowed for virtual communion, others have not. And it will be a real good debate coming out of this.
Thank you. I'll say that when I was looking into the influenza pandemic of 1918, the Eucharist was a big conversation. And there were very similar debates from what I read, with a lot of people holding off and saying, well, at least it, we can see how important it is now that we don't have it for a bit.
So I if I could jump in to answer the question, but also pose a question as part of this, 'cause I think it's fascinating to think about. So one of the challenges or the opportunities that we've been thinking about now that we've resumed in-person services, is that we now provide Zoom, meaning next to the leader of the service, there's a phone, and you can log in, and you can answer the service. It's not fully participatory in terms of there's still certain things that you're not able to say, but you can answer a large part of the service if there's a quorum of individuals in proximity on site. I think one of the questions will be going forward is do we continue to provide that? Right now we do that because there's segments of our community that don't feel comfortable being in synagogue, and we very much don't want to push people. Everyone needs to be the best judge of what's most safe for them. And so we want people to feel comfortable with that. But what does that mean? When you were talking about the doctor who can't get away or various other different things, what does that mean? Those, I think, always were exceptions that were not really talked about or explored, but might have always had reality within our tradition. For example, this hit, right around the holiday of Purim, where we read the book of Esther, and that's read from a scroll, and everyone hears every word of it. Well, this year, there are people in quarantine during that time period. And so different accommodations were made, including people listening to it on Zoom. Do we continue that next year for people who can't make it to hear Megillah, which is the scroll? Or in the past, we've actually sent readers to people's homes so that they can read, for them. And I guess the question some of that's community policy, right? How do we keep community together and not, prevent it from being kind of just a call in, BBC station that you can tune into, and how much of that is also, in terms of practical, hard religious question. But I guess my question is, at least in our community, you're describing the debate. So one of the things that COVID has done in our community is cemented some of the leadership in the ritual expertise, what we call halachic poskim, people who are ritual Jewish law decisors, that they have written responsa that majority of congregations in the Orthodox streams have now followed, and on all different issues, and the development of those halachic Jewish law rulings is going to be the subject of several dissertations in the coming years. But that's a little bit how the Jewish community does that. And so what we're doing here in West Hartford is very similar and not different from what other communities across the globe are doing in similar situations, because we have this shared respect almost for the hierarchy of the leadership within the community. I'm curious, in other faith traditions, when you were mentioning how some congregations, I mean, how is that a debate within the synagogue? Is that within the church? Or is that, how do those decisions get made, and what impact does that have on the local communities? One of the questions that come up is the autonomy of the local clergy, meaning what decisions is it the rabbi's call? What decisions is it the, lack of a better term, head rabbi's call? And alike. And I think that's an interesting question that's come up as well. And from a sociological perspective, shown some fault lines within our community in terms of where people are looking.
Because Christianity is not a monolithic, there's no one, entity that can speak. The Pope makes the call for the Catholics, and those in connectional polities in terms of Methodism and, some other groups, they make the call from their bishops. But among Baptists, which I happen to be one, the local congregation is autonomous. We are connected to a larger group, the National Baptist Convention, USA Incorporated, where there's probably about 8 million of us, but we're connected by choice. So the local congregation would end up making the decision that was best for its local congregation. For us, we still haven't gone back to in-person worship, while there are other churches that have in our local area. And that's just the way we have chosen to do it. So we needed to decide what would be best. Was it a harm to the theology? And it was a conversation held with the diaconate leadership, which was, ultimately it's left up to me as pastor, but we want to do it in communion and in community. And we thought it was the best way to continue, because as is now, we don't know when we will actually be together as the full gathered congregation. And do we not celebrate this until then? And we thought it was more important to continue the celebration. And I think it will be a shift. It will be a shift. I only can equate it to the shift in voting as a major shift. A lot of people will not go back to in-person voting when this is over. It's going to be a shift, but I think it may be a shift for the better. And it's not something that I would have ever thought of prior to March, but it will work. I don't know how they make decisions.
Would you like to address this, or?
Sure, I'll address the question from a little bit of a different angle. For Muslims in particular, it touches upon theology because it reminds us of what really matters and what really counts. There's a tradition from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that all of the earth was made as a mosque. And so it's a reminder that, okay, I need to go to the mosque, I need to go to the church or the temple, but the temple that really counts is the temple of my heart. And that's the connection that everything else depends on. And so, yes, it's great to have our rituals, but at the end of the day, God is omnipotent. God has all power. God is omniscient. He's aware of everything. He exists before everything and after everything, right? So he exists outside of time, outside of space, so on and so forth. And it reminds the human being on a deeper level of our complete dependence on God, right? The fact that our existence is contingent upon God's decree, and that we are in need of His mercy, and His grace over us. And so sometimes, as religious leaders, we focus a lot on the technical aspects in terms of, okay, can we do, as we should, right? Because we want to make sure that we're doing the right thing for our community. At the same time, we also can't lose sight of our obligation to the community to say that you're not missing anything. Religion is about being sincere in orienting yourself towards God. And if you do that in the church or in the mosque or the synagogue or the temple, um, that's one aspect of that act of devotion. And when you do it at home, it's in the same vein. And so a lot of people, especially the older generation in our community, felt this sense of loss, that, well, I'm used to doing things a certain way, and by doing it a new way, that there was some resistance to change, which is understandable. So we had to tackle that. Okay, well, what really matters is your intention. And then there was a secondary aspect, which is that, well, does the law allow that? Is the religion flexible enough? A lot of people, their experience with religion is that it's very rigid, and that, it doesn't allow for accommodating circumstances. But that's not my view of religion at all. I think that it's kind of, um, built in to our faith, that the rules have to respond to reality. And so as the reality, or as the circumstances require the rules to be relaxed, they have to adjust. And that came to the surprise of many people, because we've been fortunate for such a long period of time to be able to do things a certain way, to have our rituals done a certain way. And now that we had to separate, perhaps some things were missing, some things had to be modified. It was a great reminder that the religion allows for that to happen, because the rules assume one's ability to do so. And as soon as one is not able to do so, so for example, in our faith, eating pork is prohibited. But if that's the only thing that's available, not only is it permissible, but it might become mandatory that one preserve their own life and to consume that pork, because the sanctity of life comes before anything else. And so when you're dealing a health crisis, the sanctity of life requires us to prioritize, as Rabbi Brender mentioned, that the importance of life reminds us, it's of a higher magnitude. And so that has to take precedence over some of our religious preferences.
Thank you, Imam. We are a bit over time now, so we are going to have to conclude. I know that there were some questions, and I'm sure our panelists would be open to answering them online. I would very much like to thank our panelists for being with us tonight and sharing their wisdom with us. I hope their words have provided you with some of the reassurance that definitely they have provided me. And I'd like to add that if our panelists are in any way representative of the congregational leaders we have throughout the world, we are in very good hands. So thank you everyone for joining us for this very, very interesting and helpful conversation. And I wish you well and good night.
Thank you so much. Everyone have a blessed evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Grant. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.